There is a tracking method that hunters used for over 100 years to find their way through unfamiliar woods, locate downed game, and navigate back to camp in total darkness, without a single battery, without a single satellite, and without a single dropped pin. And it still works better than the GPS app sitting on your phone right now. Most hunters under the age of 40 have never even heard of it, and the ones who have heard of it almost never use it, because they have been trained to trust a screen instead of trusting the woods. Today I'm going to show you exactly what it is, exactly how to use it, and exactly why something this simple and this effective got completely buried by the smartphone era. Let's go. Alright guys, before I tell you what this method actually is, I want you to think about something that happened to almost every serious hunter at some point in the last few years. You are deep in unfamiliar timber, you are tracking a blood trail or working your way back to a stand in the dark, and your phone dies, or it loses signal, or the GPS app freezes because you are standing in a hollow with no clear sky view. And suddenly, the tool you have been completely dependent on for navigation is gone, and you realize you never actually learned how to find your way through the woods without it. That moment is more common than people admit. A cold battery in November weather drains twice as fast as it does in summer. A GPS app pulling a satellite signal through heavy tree canopy or down in a creek bottom can lose accuracy or lock up entirely. And if you have spent the last decade hunting exclusively with a glowing blue dot showing you exactly where you are, you have never built the actual skill of reading the land itself. That skill used to be standard knowledge. Every serious hunter, every trapper, every woodsman from 100 years ago carried it because they had no other choice. And the method I am about to show you was their primary tool for doing it. The method is called terrain association combined with pace counting, and it has been the backbone of land navigation for military scouts, surveyors, and hunters since long before GPS existed. It sounds technical when you say it like that, but I promise you it is one of the simplest, most intuitive things you will ever learn. And once you understand it, you are going to look at every piece of land you hunt completely differently. Let me start with terrain association because it is the foundation everything else builds on. Terrain association means using the natural features of the land itself. Ridgelines, creek drainages, saddles between hills, distinct rock formations, as fixed reference points that you mentally map as you move through an area. Old-time hunters did not think in terms of GPS coordinates. They thought in terms of relationships between landmarks. They knew that if they kept the creek on their left and crossed two ridge fingers, they would come out exactly where they intended. That is not luck. That is a learned skill, and it is a skill that almost nobody actively practices anymore because the phone in their pocket has done that thinking for them for the last 15 years. This is not some folk tradition with shaky origins either. Terrain association as a formal navigation method was systematized by military map reading and land navigation courses going back well over a century, and it remains a core skill taught to infantry soldiers, search and rescue teams, and professional surveyors to this day, precisely because it works regardless of weather, battery life, or satellite coverage. The reason it migrated so naturally into hunting culture is that hunters and trappers were often doing the exact same thing soldiers and surveyors were doing, moving through unmapped or poorly mapped terrain and needing a reliable way to know where they were and how to get back. The skill set is identical, only the goal at the end of the walk is different. Here is how you actually build this skill in the field, because I do not want this to be abstract. Before you ever walk into a piece of new ground, spend 10 minutes studying a topographic map of the area, either a paper map or a digital one. It does not matter which. The point is to study it before you go, not just glance at a screen while you are walking. Identify the major terrain features. Where are the ridgelines? Where does the water drain? Are there any distinct saddles, which are the low points between two hills, or any unusual rock outcroppings marked on the map? Build a mental picture of how those features relate to each other before your boots ever hit the ground. When you actually walk into that terrain, you are constantly cross-referencing what you are physically seeing with the mental map you built beforehand. You crest a ridge, and you recognize it because you already knew there was a ridge running northeast to southwest through this section. You hit a creek and you know from your map study that this creek bends sharply west about 400 yards downstream. So when you find that bend in real life, you have just confirmed your exact position without looking at a single screen. This is exactly how surveyors and military scouts navigated entire continents before satellite technology existed, and it is dramatically more reliable than people realize, because terrain does not run out of battery and terrain does not lose signal in a hollow. Now let's talk about pace counting, because this is the piece that takes terrain association from a general sense of where you are to a precise, repeatable navigation tool. Pace counting is exactly what it sounds like. You count your steps, specifically your left foot strikes only, to measure distance traveled. The average adult takes somewhere between 62 and 65 paces, counting only one foot, to cover 100 meters of relatively flat open terrain. That number changes based on your stride, the terrain difficulty, and whether you are walking uphill, downhill, or through thick brush, which is exactly why old-time woodsmen would calibrate their own personal pace count before relying on it in the field. Here is how you calibrate your own pace count, and I want you to actually go do this before your next hunt, because it takes 15 minutes and it is going to change how confident you feel navigating unfamiliar ground. Find a measured 100-meter distance. A football field is almost exactly 91 meters, so that works as a rough reference, or use a measuring wheel or a known property line if you have access to one. Walk that distance at your normal hunting pace, counting only your left foot strikes. Do this 3 times and average the result. That number is your personal pace count for 100 meters on flat ground. Mine is 64. Yours might be 60, might be 68. It depends entirely on your stride length and your build. Once you know your number, you now have a built-in odometer that lives in your own body and never needs batteries. One thing I want you to understand right away, because it trips people up the first time they try this, your pace count changes depending on the terrain you are crossing, and old-time woodsmen accounted for this instead of treating their flat ground number as fixed. Walking uphill shortens your stride and increases your pace count for the same 100 meters, sometimes by 10 or 15% on a steep grade. Walking downhill does something similar in the opposite direction in certain conditions, though loose footing can throw that off too. Thick brush, deep snow, or uneven ground all increase your count because your stride naturally shortens to maintain balance and control. The old solution to this was simple and it still works perfectly today. Calibrate a second pace count specifically on a moderate uphill grade if you regularly hunt hilly terrain, and mentally add a rough percentage adjustment, usually somewhere around 10%, whenever you are crossing thick cover or working through snow. You do not need to be scientifically precise here. You need to be close enough that your terrain association is confirming your pace count, and your pace count is confirming your terrain association, the two systems working together, rather than either one trying to carry the whole job alone. In the field, this is how the old-timers combined the two skills. They would identify a terrain feature using the map study and visual confirmation I just described, and then use pace counting to know precisely how far they had traveled between two recognized features. If you know the distance from a known starting point to your stand is approximately 350 meters based on your map, and you have walked roughly 200 paces using your personal pace count, you know with real precision approximately how much farther you have to go, even in pitch darkness, even with zero visibility, even with a dead phone in your pocket. I want to give you a real example of how powerful this combination actually is, because I used it myself a few seasons back in a situation that genuinely could have gone bad. I was hunting a new piece of public land I had only scouted once, on foot, weeks before season. Opening morning, pitch dark, I am walking into a stand location nearly a mile from the truck, and about halfway in, my headlamp dies completely. No backup, which by the way is a mistake I have fixed since then and talked about in another video. I had a phone with a flashlight function, but the battery was already low from the cold, and I did not want to burn it down to nothing relying on GPS the whole way in. Here is what got me to that stand safely in total darkness. During my scouting trip weeks earlier, I had mentally noted the terrain. A creek crossing roughly 400 meters from the parking area, a steep ridge climb immediately after that crossing, and then a relatively flat bench for the final stretch to my stand. I also had my pace count from the truck to each of those features written down on a small card in my pack, the same kind of physical backup record I have talked about before on this channel. In total darkness, I felt the ground change under my boots when I hit the creek crossing, exactly where I expected it based on my pace count. I felt the incline of the ridge climb begin right where I expected it to. And by the time the ground leveled out into that bench, I knew within 50 yards exactly where my stand was, in complete darkness, with no working light and no working GPS. I found that stand using nothing but the terrain itself and a count I had been keeping in my head for the better part of a mile. That is not a party trick. That is precisely the system that hunters, trappers, and surveyors relied on for well over a century before any of us were born. And it still works exactly as well today as it did then, because the woods have not changed. Only our reliance on technology has changed. There is a second application of this same skill set that deserves its own mention because it solves a completely different problem hunters face every season, and that is tracking wounded game over long distances. Most hunters mark a blood trail today by dropping pins on a phone app, walking forward, dropping another pin, and so on. That works fine right up until the phone dies or the trail leads into a hollow with no signal, which tends to happen at the worst possible moment, usually right as light is fading and the pressure to find the animal is highest. The old-time alternative was to mark the trail physically with flagging tape or broken branches at each blood sign while simultaneously tracking your pace count and terrain features from your last known reference point. This gives you two completely independent records of the track, a physical trail you can literally walk back along with no technology at all, and a mental record of distance and direction that lets you reason about where the animal is likely headed even when the blood sign gets thin or disappears entirely on dry leaves or hard ground. I have used exactly this combination to recover a buck that stopped leaving visible blood about 200 yards into a track, and the only reason I found him was because my pace count and terrain notes told me he had to be somewhere near a specific creek bend, and that is exactly where he had bedded down and died. Now let me address the question I know some of you are already asking, because I want to be straightforward about it. Am I telling you to throw away your GPS app and never use it again? No. I am not anti-technology. A GPS app is an excellent tool, and I use one myself for general scouting and for marking trail camera locations across a large property. What I am telling you is that a tool should never be the only thing standing between you and getting safely back to your truck. The old-timers did not have a backup option. The terrain and their own legs were the only system they had, which is exactly why they got so good at it. Modern hunters have the luxury of treating GPS as a primary tool and never developing the underlying skill at all, which means when that primary tool fails, and it eventually will, there is no backup skill sitting there to catch them. So why did this knowledge disappear so completely? I think there are two real reasons, and neither of them involves some big conspiracy, just a slow, understandable shift in how hunting knowledge gets passed down. The first reason is generational. This kind of skill used to get taught directly, father to son, mentor to apprentice, out in the field over years of walking the same ground together. As hunting participation has declined and fewer young hunters grow up with that kind of multi-year mentorship, skills like terrain association and pace counting simply stopped getting transmitted the way they used to. Nobody banned the knowledge. It just quietly stopped being passed down because the apprenticeship model that carried it for generations got thinner and thinner. The second reason is that GPS technology genuinely is convenient, and convenience always wins in the short term, even when it creates a long-term vulnerability. Why would a hunter spend an afternoon calibrating a personal pace count and studying topographic contour lines when a $500 GPS unit or a free phone app gives you an exact blue dot on a map instantly? The answer is most hunters would not, and most do not, and I understand that completely. But convenience is not the same thing as resilience. A skill that lives in your legs and your eyes cannot run out of battery, cannot lose satellite signal, and cannot get dropped and cracked on a rock in the dark. I want to leave you with something practical you can do this week, regardless of where you are in your season. Pick a piece of ground you already know well, your own property, a regular public land spot, anywhere familiar. Walk a known distance, calibrate your personal pace count the way I described earlier. Then study a topographic map of that same property and identify 3 or 4 major terrain features, ridges, creeks, saddles, anything distinct. The next time you walk that ground, consciously practice cross-referencing what you see with what you studied, and pay attention to your pace count between features. Do this enough times on familiar ground, and the skill becomes second nature on unfamiliar ground, which is exactly when you are going to need it most. If you want to take it one step further, try this drill the next time you are hunting somewhere you already know well. Turn your phone completely off, not just the screen, fully off, put it in your pack, and navigate an entire route using only terrain association and pace counting. Start small. A half-mile walk to a familiar stand is plenty for your first attempt. You will be surprised how quickly your confidence builds once you prove to yourself that you can do this without the safety net. And if you do get turned around during one of these practice runs, your phone is still right there in your pack waiting to bail you out, which is exactly the kind of low-risk environment you want for building a skill you may eventually need in a much higher stakes situation. This is not about replacing your GPS. It is about making sure that when the battery dies, when the signal drops, when the screen cracks, you are not standing in the dark woods with absolutely no idea which direction your truck is in. The hunters who came before us figured this out over 100 years ago with nothing but their own legs and their own eyes. That knowledge is not gone. It is just waiting for somebody to pick it back up. I want to hear from you. Have you ever had a GPS or a phone fail on you in the field, and how did you find your way out? Put it down in the comments below, because those stories are exactly the kind of real, hard-won knowledge this channel is built around. I read every single one of them. If you have any questions about pace counting, terrain association, or how to start practicing any of this on your own ground, drop them in the comments and I will answer everyone. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If this is going to change how confident you feel navigating unfamiliar woods this season, hit that thumbs up. Subscribe if you have not already, because we are putting out content every single week that digs up the hunting knowledge that got lost somewhere along the way and brings it back to where it belongs. Thank you for watching. Thank you for your support. And as always, God bless. Bye y'all.